Hello everybody, my name is Hatem Eujayl, but I frequently go by Arbaab. I do a lot. I'm sort of a translator and video editor, I'm sort of an author and illustrator, but perhaps most importantly, I'm a Nubian type designer, and as of now, I think the main Nubian type designer. And the funny thing is, just 1 year ago, I didn't really think about the Nubian script or Nubian type design in any real depth. And I know I wasn't alone in this. Very few people know that the Nubian languages are written, including Nubians. And the few who do know are more focused on the very fact that you can write and type in Nubian and how they can spread this knowledge, as opposed to the aesthetics of the script. The steps it takes to even know Nubian is written are so monumental that the Nubian literate kind of take it for granted that the Nubian script as we see it today on, social media, or in YouTube videos, or in books, is the same as what old Nubian scribes used. And with this in mind, we have people passionately promoting the revival of this old way of writing Nubian. The truth is, though, Nubian writing, as we see it on the screen, actually has very little to do with the ancient writing that it hopes to replicate. And a part of the reason for this is that type designers, like me, took it for granted that Nubian, as it appears on screen today, is the same as what the Nubian scribes of old used. The thing is, typefaces shape how we imagine a script. And a lot of times, when someone comes to design a typeface, their main reference is other typefaces. As a field, type design promotes efficiency and reuse of assets, and most of all, precedent. But in the case of Nubian, we need to take a careful look at how the current precedent was set. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The birth of Nubian type design as a byproduct of the revival of the Nubian script, and the type of reboot I think the field needs. So, our story begins in the region between the 1st and the 6th cataracts of the Nile, in modern-day South Egypt and northern Sudan, or, in other words, Nubia. The Kingdom of Kush, which was at the time this major African superpower and home to one of the world's oldest writing systems, has fallen for rather complicated historical reasons, and 3 new kingdoms take its place. The Kingdom of Migi, better known as Nubia, the Kingdom of Makuria, and the Kingdom of Alua. And we'll zoom in on Migi because it's here, around the 6th century, by many historians' estimates, that we see a new script take shape. You see, the Kingdom of Kush had its own writing system. It was based on ancient Egyptian writing, and we call it Meroitic. It had a hieroglyphic form and a cursive form, with the cursive form not only being older, but also being used in about 90% of Meroitic texts, for just about everything, from funerary texts to documents of political history, to all sorts of graffiti. But, as is the case with other peoples worldwide, for the Kushites, religious change meant script change. When the Kingdom of Kush fell in about 350 CE, we were seeing the increased influence of Christianity in the region. And with that, we saw the increased influence of the Greek alphabet. King Silko, who's credited with the founding of the Kingdom of Migi, actually had a famous inscription detailing the founding of this kingdom, written in Greek. So when the 3 kingdoms of Nubia become officially Christian in the 6th century, it's no real surprise that we see a Greek-based script emerge as the official alphabet of the state. However, at the same time, Nubians had their own way of writing Greek letters, and that's what so many people forget. You see, Nubians already had a writing tradition by the time they converted to Christianity. And in fact, Greek didn't do a great job at representing all the sounds that Nubian needed. So the Nubians were resourceful. They took some letters from Coptic as well as from Meroitic and combined those with Greek to make their own unique alphabet. But Nubians had their own way of writing Greek as well. Rather than write things upright, as was done in Egypt, the majority of Nubian texts are written on the slant. There are also certain peculiarities associated with individual letter forms in Nubian that made it so that hundreds of years later, British archaeologists who couldn't speak Nubian were still able to tell the difference between Nubian texts and Coptic texts just by looking at them. And for the next 9 centuries, we have this immense independent writing tradition, used primarily for religious texts, but also for personal letters and legal documents. And then religious change hits again. In the 15th century, the Christian kingdoms of Nubia fall and give way to brand new Islamic state structures. And with that, we see a new change in script. Instead of the Greek, Coptic, and Meroitic-based Nubian alphabet, we have the Arabic script instead. Not only that, we stopped seeing inscriptions written in the Nubian language, period. We know for a fact that a lot of the people leading the new Arabic written culture in this region were Nubians, including the founder of Sudan's capital city, Arbaab Eujayl, but they never used their literacy skills to write the Nubian language, at least as far as we know. And so we have hundreds of years of basically darkness. The Nubian script is more or less extinct. The very few Nubian texts that we do have are written in the Latin and Arabic scripts, and those don't show up until the 19th century, well into the colonial period. Not to mention, the Nubian language itself is also in a radically different position than it was during the time that Nubian writing flourished. Prior to the 15th century, Nubian was the language of the state, and while we can say with relative certainty that the people of the three kingdoms were multilingual, probably speaking a number of Nubian languages, alongside languages like Bidya and Arabic, Nubian was the dominant language. But by the 19th century, Arabic is the dominant language, and Nubian is no longer a lingua franca between ethnic groups. Not to mention that groups that probably spoke Nubian at some point, like the Ya'niyin and the Shoaiga, are increasingly monolingual in Arabic. And then in the 20th century, we see the decline of the Nubian languages accelerate. Nubia is split across two countries thanks to colonial borders, Egypt and Sudan, and both of these new states openly promote an oppressive Arab nationalist agenda, and with the increasing influence of the education system, as well as the increasing connection between Arabic and people's economic future, more and more Nubians are leaving Nubia for work and are leaving the Nubian language behind. Then in the 1950s, we see absolute disaster strike, as the construction of the Aswan High Dam forces thousands of Nubian families out of their homes and into majority Arabophone towns where, with the lack of state support, their languages decline even further. There is a stigma around speaking Nubian in these countries. People in Sudan literally call it Rodana, meaning gibberish, implying that it's not really a language, but something lesser. We see Nubian slip away further and further with each successive generation. And at the same time, we see an increased sense of urgency by Nubians around protecting their language and their culture. Enter the 90s. You see, when the Aswan High Dam was built, there was an international campaign to save as many Nubian artifacts as possible, and this leads to an explosion of people researching Nubian history, including the old Nubian documents from that Three Kingdoms era of Nubia. By the early 90s, we have researchers who discovered Nubian writing through these artifacts gain an interest in passing on this knowledge to other speakers of the language. I won't bore you too much with details, but long story short, by the 90s, we have three different Nubian-led associations promoting Nubian writing in the United Arab Emirates, in Egypt, and in Sudan. Someone named Abdul Qadir Shalabi, who I have a photo of on the right, who was living in the UAE, teams up with someone named Dr. Mukhtar Khalil Kabbara in Egypt, who I have on the left, and they produce what is, in effect, the rebirth of Nubian writing. The book is called Nobinga Sikir Faywa. In other words, how do we write Nubian? And the book seeks to answer its own question. It makes a case for using the Nubian alphabet to write the modern Nubian languages and demonstrates how this can be done. For our purposes, though, what I want to focus is on the typeface used. This here, that you can see on the right, and as well as on the cover of the book, is Sophia Nubian, a typeface designed by the SIL and basically the most iconic Nubian typeface. Up until this year, when my font came out, it was the only typeface for the script with Nubian in its name, and its impact is visible. A lot of people, when they tried to write Nubian for the first time, tried to mimic Sophia, as you can see in this picture here. And this was even the case for me when I started out writing Nubian. The issue is, though, for reasons likely lost to time, Sophia isn't based on Old Nubian writing, even though it's Old Nubian writing which inspired Sophia's audience to use the font in the first place. In reality, it's based on two of Nubian's sister scripts, both of which have a better established type design tradition. Greek, and, more importantly, Coptic, which is, if you remember, the Greek-based script used in Egypt, Nubia's neighbor. Not only is Sophia based on Coptic, it uses a very highly Latinized Coptic, with a lot of its independent letter forms being more reminiscent of English ones than anything from Coptic or Nubian manuscripts. Sophia also doesn't have a slant. it doesn't have the unique letter forms that make Nubian Nubian. It doesn't have Nubian letter proportion, and its version of Nubian's unique Meroitic-based letters are near unrecognizable from their manuscript forms. Yet, this is how so many people encounter Nubian writing for the first time. Sophia is the model that people tried to mimic, and, if not for some serious intervention, it's what type designers will try to mimic as well. And I've seen this. I've had someone send me a beautiful new Nubian typeface which uses Sophia as its basis. When I first started to design Nubian, I used a lot of Sophia's letter as the basis of my letter forms until I chose to model them more closely to manuscripts. In principle, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we have to remember the goal of writing Nubian. It's not a technical decision, it's a personal one. People like Dr. Kabara revived Nubian writing as a way to connect to their ancestors and this heritage that was being violently weathered away by the countries that Nubians were calling home. Yet, this precious heritage makes little impression on the aesthetics of Sophia. That is what I call part one of the revival of Nubian writing. Pioneers like Dr. Kabara and Shalabi bring Nubian writing back into public consciousness and ignite within many people a desire to see this writing system flourish. But the thing is, they were held back by technical limitations. So in the transition from old Nubian manuscripts to the typed Nubian that reintroduced Nubian writing to so many people, we lose the unique character of the Nubian script. So how do we solve this? Like I said earlier, in type design, there is a tendency to rely on precedent, namely typed precedent when developing fonts. But when we design Nubian, we have to recognize that the main font being used to write it is actually counter to the goals of the entire Nubian script revival. This is the mindset behind what I call part two of the revival of Nubian writing. We are blessed with the work of Dr. Kabara before us, as well as the power of modern technology to allow us to fully achieve what he and his contemporaries initially set out to do. Nowadays, we can find an old Nubian manuscript just by writing those words in Google Images, and that, not Sophia, is what should be the basis for Nubian typefaces. This was the idea presented by Joel Mitchell of Taros Press when he began developing the Faros typeface, where I have some examples of letters here compared to their manuscript forms, as well as their forms in Sophia and Antunuo, which is a very famous Coptic font that's often used to write Nubian as well. Faros is still a work in progress, but it is the spirit of Faros which drove the development of my font, Sawara the Nubian, where I also have some examples of letters, which is now the first publicly available Nubian typeface that's actually based on old Nubian manuscripts. Okay, so from a technical standpoint, how do we reinsert Nubian's individuality into Nubian writing? The first thing to get right is ductus, ductus, ductus. To design Nubian, we need to write Nubian, and thankfully, the ancestors left us with a way to learn to do that. They like to use thick pens, so when you look at something like the Beta in an old manuscript, you can see, based on which parts are thick versus thin, how the scribe went about writing the letter, which in this case is with 3 strokes instead of about 2 or 1, depending on who you ask in English. On the Twitter page, Gerifai Omir, which I co-manage with Joel Mitchell and Rami Daoud, there are a series of videos that detail exactly how to go about writing each Nubian letter if analyzing manuscripts isn't your thing. The next thing is letter proportions. A lot of Nubian texts like to have extreme descenders and ascenders, giving the script this really extravagant look at times with the types of flags and tails you get from letters. Nubian also has certain letters that are actually shorter than what you will find in their counterparts in other scripts, like the lambda. Or you have letters that are much bigger than their counterparts in other scripts, which, if we look back at the slide here, you can see the letter phi is way bigger than you would expect in something like Greek or English. So, again, the ancestors have kind of left us all the clues, and there's no shame in straight up tracing a letter to get a sense of what it's supposed to look like. That's what I did for a lot of Sawara's forms in order to properly replicate the script. The third thing is the slant, which is one of Nubian's most iconic aesthetic features. Sometimes people who write with Sophia try to replicate this by italicizing the script, but there are a lot of subtleties that they overlook. The Nubian slant behaves differently on different letters. Most slant right, but a few slant left, and many don't slant at all. Replicating the Nubian slant means thinking of the slant as an inherent property of the letters versus a modifier to default forms, which is usually how we think of the slant when designing Greek type or English type. And this is why I also advocate against making, say, a variable font if you're trying to replicate the Nubian slant, or designing letters upright and then slanting them later. The Nubian slant requires an individualized approach to the different letters. But I want to stress this is of comparatively less importance in contrast with dectus and letter proportions. There are upright Nubian texts which still look Nubian because of how the letters are written or proportioned. Again, type design has this powerful ability to shape how we imagine scripts, especially today. For a lot of people, the first time they encounter something not written in the dominant language may be online and therefore through a typeface. This is especially true of scripts that aren't formally taught in the education system. Type will provide the model for writing, not vice versa. As a result, when designing any endangered script, especially one with a long history like Nubian, there needs to be extra special attention paid to what the typeface takes as its model. For most of the scripts that people design typefaces for, other typefaces already have done the work of translating the manuscript tradition of the script into type, but we shouldn't take for granted that this is the case with every script. We see this struggle with the Javanese script from Indonesia, for instance, and we have the same struggle with Nubian. To complete the revival that Dr. Cabaro started to make a beautiful Nubian type design future, we need to go back and give Nubian heritage the respect that it deserves. Nubian individuality can coexist with modern type design standards. So Warda proves that. So type designers should respect the individuality and respect that the audience is trying to connect with their ancestors. And I think the results will be beautiful. Thank you.